Hello friends, welcome. This is Dr. M. Rajesh, Regional Director, IGNOR Regional Center, Vadagara, presenting a very short presentation on the topic, the WTO, the World Bank and the IMF. Now the purpose of this presentation is to bring you the basics of what these three organizations actually deal with. More importantly, my aim here is not only to bring you the basics of these three organizations, but also to tell you in brief how these three institutions are related to each other. Now, this is an area which will come in both international relations, economics, at both the graduate and the postgraduate level. So I feel this will be a useful presentation, but this is no substitute for the matter that has been given in your text. So kindly go through your study materials very carefully. Before we start, let me emphasize upon this point. I know this is a very difficult phase in our recent history because of the fact that we are all embroiled in the terror that is created by the coronavirus. But due to the very positive steps taken by the government of India and the state governments, we are able to cope with this tyranny. I request you to adhere to all the measures which have been suggested by the central and the state governments as well as the local authorities, and be safe and maintain social distancing. So without wasting much time, let me move into the topic of today's discussion, that is WTO, World Bank and the IMF. Now, when we talk about the topic, the IMF, the WTO and the World Bank, we should all remember that basically we are dealing with three separate entities. Two of them have come into existence at the same period of time, whereas the other one, the third one, has come into existence quite recently. The IMF and the World Bank, for that matter, can be considered as the Bretton Woods twins, because they came into existence as a result of the various deliberations that took place during the Bretton Woods conferences and the other conferences which took place nearby that time in the 40s of the last century. And the WTO, for that matter, came into existence in 1995, which is quite recent when we talk about the time frames that we are talking about. Now, these three institutions should have come in at the same time. However, there's a divergence in the time frame when these three came into existence because of certain geopolitical factors. Now, along with the IMF, the World Bank, it was expected that the International Trade Organization, an organization which was stipulated to come in at the time of the creation of IMF and World Bank, would also come in at the same time. However, at that time, the predominant economy of the world, the United States of America, had its own reservations regarding the formation of the International Trade Organization. And as a result of that, it was decided to defer the International Trade Organization's creation till such time that there is a consensus on its formation. However, the IMF and World Bank, which were of more immediate necessity at that time, came into being. Now let us discuss about the IMF. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, as we all know, was formed in 1944, of course, as a result of the various deliberations that took place in Bretton Woods and the other conferences which took place at that time. And the main aim of this institution is to manage the balance of payment crisis that any country across the world, or to be more precise, any member country across the world would fall into. And therefore, it has its own resources which are sourced from country-specific quotas and the loans that countries provide to it according to the need that it is supposed to meet. Now, as far as the quota is concerned, every country has a quota which is determined by its economic might in the world economy. And as a result, you will see that the countries which are more powerful economically in the world will have a greater quota. And the loans, of course, is based on the willingness and the balance of payment situation that a country, various countries face at various points in time. So if they have a surplus at a certain point in time, they will be happy to lend these resources to other countries as and when they are needed. Now, one thing that has to be noted as far as these loans, which IMF gives to the needy nations is concerned, is that each and every loan that the IMF gives comes with a certain conditionality. Now, basically speaking, these conditionalities are meant for the betterment of those countries. That is, they are intended to make those countries more efficient in their functioning. However, what happens often is that the countries which receive loans are those countries which are at their wit's end due to balance of payment crisis, and their internal structures are totally broken down. Now, in such a situation, when the conditionalities do come in, it often becomes difficult for the countries to cope with these conditionalities. Now, what are these conditionalities generally? These conditionalities normally are related to privatization. What? Privatization, because it is assumed that privatizing institutions would definitely improve the efficiency of those institutions due to the inherent competitive nature that it brings. Then better governance mechanisms. Now, many of the third world countries are faced with governance difficulties. Now, the governance part relates to various laws and their implementation, and that is why the IMF places a lot of importance on the governance part. Now, talking about governance, we can give a number of examples related to governance. There are laws related to the exit policy, the labor policy, so on and so forth, which affect the functioning of the private sector and the economy as a whole. So, when we talk about conditionalities of the IMF insists that there should be governance reforms where the governance part is weak. Then there should be budgetary controls, because in many of these countries which are seeking these loans, the balance of payment crisis has occurred basically because of the fact that they were not able to curtail the budgets that they were handling. Now, there are many unwanted and unwarranted expenditures in countries, and these should be brought under control, and that is one of the reasons why this part is being emphasized upon. Then there is also this issue of proper valuation of currency. Sometimes it is found that either the currency is overvalued or undervalued. Undervalued in very rare cases, but it can be overvalued, resulting in factors which affect the exports of the countries and affects the export competitiveness of the firms producing exportable goods. So very often what happens is that when a loan is being given by the IMF to the recipient countries, they ask for devaluation of the currency, and that has been the experience of India also a few years back when we took loans from IMF. Now, coming to the World Bank, this bank is also known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it came in along with the IMF, that is in 1944. Now, the major aim of this institution is to reconstruct the economies which have been ravaged by poor economic factors, and it also deals with infrastructural funding, private sector funding through this International Finance Corporation, which is a subsidiary of this institution, and it also has the avowed aim of ending extreme poverty by the year 2020. Now, as on date, the World Bank has 189 members, which is quite a huge number when we talk about. So basically, the long-term development plans of the economies and the long-term development needs of the economies are basically taken care of by the World Bank. So that's the basic difference between the IMF and the World Bank. IMF normally deals with short-term liquidity crunch of countries, and World Bank goes in for long-term development related investments. So the aims and objectives of both these institutions are quite different. Now, as far as the conditionalities are concerned, World Bank also sometimes imposes conditionalities which are quite similar to what the IMF imposes. Earlier, they used to be different, but in these days, it is more or less similar. Then coming to the World Trade Organization, it was formed on 1st January 1995, and preceding the formation of the World Trade Organization from 1950s onwards, there had been a number of rounds, or the GATT rounds as we call them, where various levels of tariff reduction, then quantitative restriction reduction, and freeing up of world trade was discussed by the countries of the world. Prominent examples of such rounds are the Tokyo round, for example. Tokyo round basically dealt with the non-tariff barriers, which we are talking about. And of course, the most important round was the Uruguay round, where discussions for the formation of a World Trade Organization actually took place. And the Uruguay round also discussed the aspect of agriculture. So, basically speaking, the WTO was preceded in its preparation by a number of rounds leading up to the formation of the WTO on the 1st of January 1995. Now, the WTO, as we all know, has a number of multilateral agreements between countries on agriculture, sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, then intellectual property rights, investment regimes, so on and so forth. So, the WTO basically deals with the trade aspect, and the aim of the WTO is to liberalize world trade as far as possible. Now, coming on to the next thing, how are the WTO, IMF and the World Bank linked to each other? This is a critical question. Now, as we all know, all three institutions are in one way linked to finance and trade linkages. Now, when we talk about the conditionalities of either either the IMF or the World Bank, one of the conditionalities that it imposes is current account convertibility. Now, current account, as we all know, deals with two important areas of trading goods as well as services. So, it practically covers the entire range of trade that takes place. So, when the IMF and the World Bank imposes this conditionality that the countries should reform its current account, it basically means that it wants to augment the trade capacity of the country so that the world trade also increases. And as a result of this, you find that it is an umbilical cord which links the IMF and World Bank with the WTO, because freeing up of world trade through current account convertibility and its reforms definitely bolsters the aim of the WTO. That is basically one of the major ways in which the WTO, the IMF and the World Bank are linked to each other. Now, this is an activity which you can try out. Check out the recent activities of IMF, World Bank, and see whether they have been able to strengthen the role of WTO through world trade. Now, this you can find out by basically visiting the websites of all these three organizations, the IMF, World Bank and the WTO, and you can note down the points where the IMF and World Bank has actually looked for enhancing world trade through its conditionalities and various other recommendations, and how it has actually helped the WTO in increasing the extent of world trade as far as it could. So this is an activity which you can take up, and it will be good for all students, both from the economic stream as well as from the stream of political science and international relations, to go into such a question. I thank each and every one of you for having given me a patient listening. I hope I can come back in future with other videos as well. Hope you like this video. Once again, stay safe and take care of yourselves and your family. See you. Bye.